Welcome, everyone. My name is Terry Lawson. I'm a consumer attorney at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri. Our main office is in St. Louis, Missouri, but we cover most of the states of Eastern Missouri. And this video will be about the recent CDC anti-eviction order and how to use the declaration that is provided in that order for tenants and others that may have problems facing some sort of eviction activity. Because the order is nationwide, this video could be applicable in a variety of states and certainly throughout the state of Missouri. You should always consult an attorney of your own for specific legal advice about your situation, as state laws, local laws, and various regulations differ from place to place. With that all said, I'm going to present the slide deck now, and this slide deck will be available for download from our website at www.lsem.org. You'll see that right here above my shoulder. And if you need to call regarding any housing emergency, or you have facing an eviction, or you have other legal issues and you think you may qualify for our free legal services, you can always dial this number up above, 314-534-4200. And with that, we'll begin the slide deck. As I mentioned, the title of this presentation is the CDC Anti-Eviction Order, a guide for tenants. And we have the locations of all of the units in Missouri that you could go to or you could request assistance from. And I wanted to mention here, the summary of this video will be available for download, and the video itself and the slide deck and a variety of materials. So at the end of this session, if you don't have time for a longer session, you could zip to the end and see the basic summary and the links to the various guides we've created for you. And that might speed up, if you're short on time, speed up your ability to use these resources. The resource page will be also web links to a variety of places, including where to download the declaration for the CDC order and where to find other assistance for things like rental assistance, financial assistance, and others. So we do hope you visit our COVID-19 help page and look at the various resources available there. Also, you can follow our social media for updates and videos. If you download the video that I've presented here or this slide deck, these are all clickable links and would go right to our social media. We do post updates there from time to time, so do follow. The CDC order that we will discuss today comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is a Department of Health and Human Services department, and the CDC itself acts as the nation's really most important health protection agency. Their job at the CDC is to make sure that the United States is healthy and will protect us from various threats. You may have seen movies where the CDC was mentioned in a viral outbreak, or even zombie movies that mention the CDC. Here we have something like COVID-19, which has swept the country and has caused problems throughout the land. The CDC has monitored the situation and has finally decided that as a public health measure, they need to make sure they protect the public, because the COVID-19 threat is in fact a serious threat, a historic threat to public health, unlike any we've seen since probably the influenza epidemic in the early 20th century. So why exactly did they issue the order, the CDC? We see that over 5 million cases have been diagnosed of COVID-19 throughout the world. It's 5.5 million cases rather in the United States, but there were 174,000 deaths as of August 24th, and that number is climbing close to 200,000. So there have been very serious efforts to limit COVID-19, but we see that further action is needed. So the CDC has decided this drastic step should be taken to protect public health, and that is to issue an eviction moratorium. This moratorium is a stay, if you will. When you hear the word moratorium, that just means a pause. And these are often effective public health measures. We had a CARES Act stay recently, starting in March, for the CARES Act that was issued by Congress. And now we see the executive branch through the CDC issuing its own order to protect public health, and to prevent certain evictions. The video today describes how that order will work and what you must do to be protected by the order. Here's the exact language from the order itself. There will be in later slides places you can download the entire order in the Federal Register, the official copy, as well as copies elsewhere. Subject to the limitations of what they call the applicability section, in other words, who it will apply to. A landlord or an owner of a residential property or a person with any legal right to pursue eviction or a possessory action shall not evict any covered person from any residential property in any state or U.S. territory where there are cases of COVID-19. And this means that in any case where a state or local authority has not provided a higher level of public health protection, then this order will take place and will control to provide public health protection in the area of evictions to prevent people from needing to move from their home. Now, the order right now is going to run from September 4th to December 31st, 2020. And in this order, the word evict has a special meaning. We'll talk later about what that is. Evict or eviction actually doesn't just mean a judicial eviction, but also includes other steps that will be related to a judicial eviction as well. Now, where we would find COVID-19 cases is basically all of the 50 states right now. So the CDC order is fairly applicable everywhere. And Missouri does not have any standards, at least at current, that would provide higher public health protections. You may live in a state, if not Missouri, that would have higher protections, or a local government that may have provided higher protections. If you do, then this order is not applicable. So under the CDC order, what is eviction? The eviction, the pause that's placed is on evict or eviction activities. And under the order, the rule is fairly clear. I've broken this out on the screen so you can kind of see the clauses of the order and break out some of this legalese. The literal order says it's any action by a landlord, the owner, or other person that to remove or cause the removal of a covered person from a residential property. So remove or cause the removal, any action taken to remove or cause the removal. That's much broader than just a judicial eviction. If there are other acts that might be taken, for example, forcing someone out by locking doors, turning off electricity, the other things that landlords may unfortunately do from time to time to force people out, these would be actions used to prevent or to try to remove a covered person. And those actions would be covered as well. We think at Legal Services that it would even extend to cases of eviction that are filed or rent and possession type cases prior to the judge's eviction order, because by filing a case and seeking possession, you are seeking to remove or cause the removal of a covered person. Now, if the person isn't covered by doing all the steps they need to do or because they don't otherwise qualify, then of course this order wouldn't take effect. But if you are a party that has done everything you need to do, then a landlord should have to pause and not take any of these actions. Keep in mind this is basically a rental and a tenancy type of protection, and this is not a foreclosure type protection as well. So if you're a covered person, and that really means, as we described at the beginning, you live somewhere that this order might apply, and Missourians do, and you have actually signed a declaration that allows the order to take control. The rule indicates, it says to invoke the order's protection. So you have to sign a declaration and actually provide that to the proper party. We'll go into that in more detail later. There are 5 types of unprotected eviction activities or actions taken, and for these things, these 5 types would not be covered. And we should discuss that first because there are certainly many ways that the order might be ineffectual. If you have engaged in a criminal activity while on the premises, you've threatened the health or safety of residents, you have damaged or you are posing immediate and significant risk of damage to the property that you're renting, you violated public health codes, health ordinances, or other similar regulations, or any other contractual obligation besides the rent obligation. If those are the reasons you're being evicted, or that the landlord is taking activity moving forward to try to remove you, these things are exceptions to the coverage of the order. And if you think of it, that makes a little bit of sense. If there was severe damage being done to the property, or if there was a health code violation that was serious, or the criminal activity within the unit itself, landlords need to be able to remove those risks because those actually cause harm to the other tenants in an area. So the order was careful to provide some protection for landlords to do those types of activities, but not simply to remove people for other more innocuous, harmless reasons, such as you couldn't afford to pay the rent. Now, it's important to know that the CDC's order is effective only for each adult resident that is mentioned in the lease who provides a signed declaration. And I'll go into this in further detail on another slide, but it does say not only the leasing party if you have a written lease, but as someone that is mentioned in the lease as an occupant, and that's an adult party, then that person also would need to file this declaration or provide the declaration to the landlord in order to have protection. And we will go into further detail on what providing means, but it's listed here on the slide. Also, it must be provided to the landlord, a property owner, or anyone else who has the power to evict or kick out the resident. So the eviction activities that are prohibited are those same three groups of people: landlords, property owner, anyone else that could evict. And those are also the people that the tenant or adult living there could provide the order, the declaration rather, to. Those are the same groups in both parts of the rule. Now keep in mind, the CDC's order is not rent relief for anyone that's behind on rent. It doesn't erase the rent or erase late fees or other types of similar charges. Those things will continue to run if you evoke the protections of the order. It also, unfortunately, doesn't really provide any kind of free pass to violate other terms of the lease, or even just the rules, terms, and conditions of the apartment complex. If you were to break some of those rules and your lease says that you could be terminated for that, then this order would not provide very good protection, probably no protection in those situations. It's important, if you want to stay in the apartment and abide by the rules, that would prevent a landlord from having a reason to evict you for other than a non-payment situation. So it's very important to comply as much as possible with all the terms of the lease or other rules in the apartment complex. So I've mentioned this word declaration multiple times. What is the CDC declaration that you would need to provide to invoke the protection of this order? Well, here's a legal tip. You may have heard the word affidavit on a TV show or in a case at some point, but a lot of folks don't hear the word declaration in a legal sense very often. To declare something in a legal sense here means to do it under oath, but without needing a notary to sign that off that they've sworn you in, or you're not at court being sworn in by a judge or a clerk, but it still has the same legal effect. You're basically saying under oath that I declare under penalty of perjury that these things are true. So the perjury rules of the federal government apply with this order. If you do complete a declaration and sign and date that and provide it, it means that that's an under oath statement. So it's very important that you don't commit any perjury. And the order itself mentions in its sample that it says, quote, this declaration is sworn testimony, meaning that you could be prosecuted, go to jail, or pay a fine if you lie, mislead, or omit important information. So it isn't something you would do lightly. You should very carefully consider if the declaration is right for you. And if it is, you're fine to sign it. But I would not just, look at it quickly, glance through, and sign off. It's really worth some analysis for everyone. So do not sign this declaration if you don't understand what you're signing, or if any of the terms in it, the requirements of the declaration, are not true for you. There are going to be 5 big categories of requirements that I'll go over today. If you're not sure about the declaration itself and how to use it, we at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri and other legal services organizations in our state, various nonprofit organizations, can provide legal advice to those that need it. There are also, of course, private attorneys and volunteer attorneys and pro bono attorneys that may be willing to assist for little or no charge. You'll have to seek out those resources on your own. We certainly encourage you, if you think you need assistance, to seek an attorney that might be able to work through how to make out this declaration. There are also certain online interview procedures that you can do, but I want to point out that these online interviews walk you through the process of examining the requirements, but they can't really provide legal advice. So bear in mind that that is an easy way to at least get through the declaration if you're not sure. But you need to realize too that there's no actual legal advice being really doled out in those ways. At the end of this video, we'll also have on our resources page places you can go to either get a copy of the declaration to fill out or to go through one of these online guided interviews. So here are the 5 requirements that the CDC order, the declaration requires from the CDC order. And I'll summarize these without reading them literally. The first one is that you've made best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or for housing. So it would be rental financial assistance or finding a housing location if there's a local area housing unit available. You also have to meet an income requirement, and that's relatively easy to do for most regular people. You also have to have been unable to pay rent or your housing payment for specific reasons, such as income loss, loss of work hours, wages, layoffs, or extraordinary medical expenses. Then fourth, you have to have made best efforts and continue to make best efforts to pay your rent or as much of your rent as you're able to pay, given your specific personal circumstances. And you have to be able to truthfully say that if you were evicted, if you did have to leave your rental unit, then you would probably, or you would likely be homeless, have to go to a homeless shelter, or have to live somewhere in a crowded condition, what they refer to as close quarters, with perhaps family, friends, whomever. If you were couch surfing, you have to be on a couch somewhere and there's not a lot of room. These are the types of scenarios that as a public health service, the CDC wants to assure that we avoid that as much as possible. They don't want doubling up, tripling up, having a lot of people in one bedroom and so forth. So these are the 3 standards to say it would be likely one of those 3 things would occur for me if I were evicted. That would cover requirement 5. So we'll break these down slowly and go over them a little bit more because I think it's important that everybody think about, does this work for me? Is this declaration something I can truthfully use? And so what does the first requirement say? I have used best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing. And so what that means really, best efforts is a little hard to define. It's unclear to us in our analysis so far what the government would refer to as the absolute best efforts. When you say best efforts, it really means pretty extensive options, or you've exhausted your options. So what we would say is to, at the very least, make a reasonable attempt to examine all of the things you can do in the local area to obtain government assistance for rent or housing. We think it's important that you take actual steps. You don't just maybe glance at a form, but that you actually make calls, you check with organizations so that you can document that you've done what you could to try to find maybe rental assistance or a place to live temporarily that was being offered, and that you've done those things in a way that can really show you made your best effort. All available assistance, according to the rule, the order itself says any governmental rental or housing payment benefit, any at all. So it's super broad. The problem will be, would any one person know every single program? Clearly no. but that's why it's important to try to find everything you can, see if you've exhausted all options. And at each resource, I would say to them, is that all there is? Is there something else I could try? And if you've done everything you can find, I think that puts you in a fairly safe position. One of the best resources we have that works basically as a nexus, a place for everything to come together, a directory, if you will, to find resources, is the United Way. In the St. Louis area, they have a website, United Way. It's 211helps.org, but you can easily Google United Way and find your local location. And there are specific COVID-19 resources, and there are specific CARES Act funding resources that United Way can link you to fairly quickly. That's one of the things United Way, one of our partners, does exceptionally well, is figures out what problem a person has and what services they might be able to link them to. So United Way would be a great place to start. For the second requirement of the order, the declaration of the order rather, you have to have met the income requirement, but this is probably the easiest one for anyone to meet. The literal language is here on the screen. Basically, if you're making under $100,000 a year as an individual, or $200,000 almost as a couple, or you've received a CARES Act check in the past, a relief check, or you don't have to report income at all. The IRS legally allows you to not report your income, and certain people qualify for that. All of those people would meet the income requirement. So this is practically everybody in the United States, other than extremely wealthy people, that would have met one of these things. It's very doubtful a party would be unable to meet the second requirement. This is almost always going to be okay. So moving to the third requirement of the declaration, are you unable to pay your rent or housing payment? So the literal language is, I am unable to pay my full rent or make a full housing payment due to a substantial loss of household income, loss of compensable hours of work or wages, layoffs, or extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. A lot of words there, so we're going to break it down and make it simpler, okay? What this really means is, although there are no definitions for a substantial loss of income, if you've suffered a loss of income, a layoff, anything like that, that would reduce your income and make it where you can't make your rent, then probably you're safe to say that's a substantial loss. So I don't think it's as important that we think of, is there a specific percentage amount there, but it is important to realize that with your budget and your situation, the loss you've taken is a substantial loss. Does that loss have to be directly related to COVID-19? The answer is no. The rule doesn't have anything in it about why that loss occurred. You just have to be able to report that you have had a substantial loss and that prevents you from making rent. The extraordinary medical clause, if that were the reason you might be unable to pay rent, there is a definition in the rule for that, and that is 7.5% of your adjusted gross income. If you had a pile of medical bills that total up to 7.5% of your annual income, that would also count to be considered as a difficulty to make it unable to pay rent. The fourth requirement is another best efforts requirement, but this one is to actually pay the rent. The first one, remember, was best efforts to find services or assistance. This one is making best efforts to pay the rent or housing payment you have. It says, quote, I am using best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual circumstances may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. So again, a really long phrasing. What does it mean in simple terms? What it means is you need to pay what you can pay in rent. This depends on your own ability to pay. Your circumstances are different from others. But what we really want to show is if you are paying your other bills that you must pay, those are the non-discretionary expenses. I still have to pay these other things. And you're unable to make a full rent payment. The rule is saying you must make as much as you can of that payment to the landlord in order to be covered by this rule. You have to make sure that you budget carefully and determine what would be available to you to make a payment, and then move forward in making every effort to pay the landlord timely. Notice the rule did say a timely payment, not late payments, but try to pay on time, even if it's short. So you should always, when you pay, you should always keep proof of your payments. I would say never do cash unless you absolutely have to do it. And even then, make sure that you have some kind of receipt. It is much better to pay with a check, a cashier check, a money order, or some other way that will leave a paper trail so that you have a check stub or some portion when the landlord receives the cash, the money. Also, if the landlord refuses payments, you should record that as well. You should mark down that this was offered on a certain day, this particular amount, check number whatever, money order whatever, and that was refused. I think that's important because if the landlord ever challenges you did not make best efforts, you have to show that you did at least try to pay. Landlords will sometimes refuse payments in order to not waive any fees or rent from the past. There are legal rules that get a little tricky regarding if they accept the payment later. So if they want someone to leave, they'll refuse rent in order to try to speed that up. And that's where this gets a little tricky for most consumers. What you want to do, though, is if you do have rent refused, it might be a great idea to set that aside for later, because there might be a later time when you could pay that rent. For example, if you are sued in Missouri, you can do what's called stay and pay in a rent and possession action. And what that would mean is if you come up with all the rent owed at the time of or before the trial, you can actually avoid having to pay or having to go to trial on that action. You could actually end up staying in the apartment, in the rental. What we want to make sure that you know is if you are getting refused from rent, you've got to probably plan to set that money aside if you can to protect yourself later. Because remember, the order never stops rent from accruing. It continues to add up whether or not you can get a payment to the landlord. Finally, the fifth requirement of the declaration is that you have no other housing options. The literal rule or the declaration says, if evicted, I would likely become homeless, need to move into a homeless shelter, or need to move into a new residence shared by other people who live in close quarters because I would have no other available housing option. Now, let's break that down further. No other available housing option. Well, what does that mean? According to the order, it means anything that's available and unoccupied residential property. Remember, the order is going to cover residential leasing, not businesses. So it has to be a residential property available. But also, what about this? Other space for occupancy in seasonal or temporary housing. So if there's temporary housing available or seasonal housing, like summer housing, for example, or winter housing, if there are other places that have that, these temporary locations are also potential available property. If those are there and it would not violate a federal, state, or local occupancy standard, and it wouldn't increase your housing cost, those are your available housing options. So if there are rentals all around and there are spaces open, one of the questions that's going to be difficult for folks is to figure out, how have I proven that I don't have available housing options? We would say if you're able to move, if you're able to find another place at the same price or less, and something's available to you, you probably should try to take that instead of use this order to stay in your current location. The idea of the order is to keep you from having to be homeless or in a shelter or in a crowded condition. But if you're able to successfully move, then probably you do that. It's if you're unable, you've checked, you've applied, you've been refused, you can't find places, that's where this order really kicks in. So if you're in that position, this provides you with some protection. Again, it would be important for you to document that you've tried to find locations and that you were unable to find an available housing option. As I mentioned in the prior slide, the qualification portion here is probably the most important aspect. So long that you have sought housing and can't find any available, you would probably meet the requirement. But don't be in a position where you've never looked or you've only called one place, because that would end up making it look as if you did not exhaust all options. Okay, so we've talked a lot about requirements of the declaration for the CDC order, requirements for this item that you're going to sign under penalty of perjury. So where would you find a copy of this declaration? We at Legal Services have prepared a fillable PDF form. What that means is a form you could put up on your computer screen and type it in. If you could go to a local library or somewhere else, if you don't have computer access, you could actually type that in and save that document, and it would be ready for you to deliver. There are also other locations throughout the internet that you might find this declaration. The official version from the CDC, their example attachment, is available at the link I've provided in this slide deck. It's part of the Federal Register, which is a place where orders and regulations get published by the federal government. And there's a sample declaration there as well. Now, our declaration is a little different from the official sample. If you look carefully at the order, one thing you need to know is that they don't have to be identical to what the CDC put out. A declaration can be slightly variable. It basically says it must be substantially similar. So, it doesn't have to be in the exact same font. It doesn't have to be exact same size. If you add a little bit at the bottom like we did, we were confident that that would be substantially similar. What we added on ours, just so you know, is we added a spot to print your name and a spot to list the address where you rent. And the reason we did that is the official document does not have anything other than a signature line and a date for the declarant to fill out. So if you just do a signature that's hard to read and you mail that in, a landlord in a 100-unit property would say, I don't know who this is. I don't know what this looks like or what this is. So I can't really apply it to anyone. So what we've done is made sure, and I would suggest if you use a different form, you do make sure that the landlord knows who it's from. You could easily print your name by your signature, and you could print the address of the unit where you live, particularly if you're not on a lease as the main person leasing, but you're another adult. You would really want to make sure they know I live in this location, in this unit, and this is my printed name, and this is my declaration. That's really, really important to do that. So watch on these other resources online that if you use a declaration that doesn't have those, you might want to make sure that you put it on there. I mentioned before online interview sites where you can walk through the process of filling out a declaration. These can guide you through the form, but they can't give legal advice. Now, you need to decide the answers when you do this based on the questions they give you. But like any computer program, what old computer programmers used to say is GIGO, G-I-G-O, garbage in, garbage out. And what that meant is when they wrote a program and they put in wrong data or wrong sections in the program, they'd get gobbledygook back. The program wouldn't work right. Likewise, be careful of garbage in, garbage out when you do an online interview. If you don't answer truthfully or you don't understand the process and so you can't really properly fill things out, it's likely that what you get as an end product isn't going to be what you expected or what you should have gotten. People work very hard on these programs to make sure that they are easy to understand, but they're never perfect. So be careful as you fill one out that you're confident, just like you know everything that the form says and you understand it, you also understand the process as you're walking through a guided interview. Be careful of doing something that's going to make it not run the way it's expected to run. Here are some of the locations you can find an online interview. If you'd rather do that instead of a printed declaration in a local location, Law Help Interactive has one based out of Michigan, I believe, and we've put the link there. Mass Access is the Suffolk Law Litigation Lab, and that was also one we felt was a fairly well-designed guided interview. And the Kentucky Equal Justice Center is another that is a fairly well-designed guided interview. These are just 3 examples of probably many throughout the country. And because this is a federal law, most of the time, individual state issues aren't going to be as important in this area. But be wary if you use one from out of state that it doesn't wander into topics related to that state's law as opposed to your state where you live. Now, we must make sure that when you complete a declaration that you provide this to the landlord. And how do you go about doing that? You provide the declaration in order to invoke the CDC's order, and you have to provide an executed copy. So it doesn't need to be the original. It needs to be an executed, a signed copy of the form. And you provide it to one of those 3 people that I mentioned before, people or businesses, the landlord, the owner of the property, and that may be the landlord, right? Or maybe it isn't, or another person who would have the power to kick you out. So sometimes there are management companies. Other times we might see that one big business owns a property. The landlord is a different party or business, and then they have an attorney that handles all of their eviction work. So it may be that you have 3 different parties you could provide this to. It doesn't say you have to provide it to more than one of those, but if you know there are 3 different people involved in your particular rental, you could provide it to all of them. That's okay. Better to be safe than sorry, because these are just copies after all. So it's okay to send one to the owner and one to the management company. Look on your lease for who the landlord is, the name of the landlord. And there's usually in any lease a notice provision that allows you to know where you would send something in writing to the landlord. If all else fails, usually sending it to where you make a payment would be sufficient as well, or providing the copy there. Remember again, anybody that's on the lease, written in the lease, any adult, should provide a declaration if they wish to be covered. The declarations must be signed and dated. As I mentioned, the only lines for completion were a signature and date in the official form. We added print your name, print your address on it, okay? Also, this provision of who you provide it to is made very clear in the order: landlord, property owner, or some other person that could kick you out, right? And provide isn't really described in the order at all. What does provide mean? So we take it for its literal regular meaning. You provide it in any way, in person, by email, by fax, however you choose. But, this is important. But make sure that you have proof of delivery of that declaration to the proper person or company, one of them that fits those 3 conditions. Good ways you could have proof would be a hand delivery, and then you would be able to testify you did it, or you have an email that you send with it as an attachment. When an email goes, it's pretty well normal that if it's rejected, it gets kicked back and you know about it. Certified mail would also work. Sometimes people refuse certified mail though, so that's not always ideal. Regular mail would certainly get it there, but it would be hard to prove when they received it. But it wouldn't be wrong, it just would be hard to prove it. A courier is a good example also. FedEx, UPS, these sorts of things. Rarely will people want to refuse FedEx or UPS, and it's not too many dollars to send something that way. So many of these different ways could work. The big key is, if they try to claim, the landlord claims we never got a declaration, what would you do to prove that you did actually provide that declaration? Okay, so we're out now at the end of the overall presentation. I'm going to do a quick 1-page summary here, the highlights, if you will. This order, remember, is to protect public health. It's not a rent abatement. It's not a landlord versus tenant. It's literally to help everyone. Keep in mind that the goal is to prevent the spread of COVID-19 because of crowded conditions and homelessness. And if any landlord provides any problem with that or has a problem with that, then you can certainly address that this isn't really a friction situation, but it's really about public health. Remember though, it doesn't stop rent charges. Rent charges, late fees, etc. continue to accrue. That's one of the reasons that you need to be sure that you pay what you can when you can, because that pile of rent owed will grow unless it is paid. So if you do have to stay over, keep in mind that there is a running rent clock there. If you do not provide the declaration, there will be no protection. The only way you invoke the order is to provide the declaration to one of the three parties mentioned: landlord, owner, someone else that could kick you out. Make very clear that that is done before you rely on this to prevent eviction. Remember that this covers more than literal judicial eviction, but all actions, any actions to remove the party, right, unless it's one of the exceptions. These eviction actions could be things like stapling on the door or taping on the door. You need to be out of here. We're going to remove you. We're shutting off your electric so you'll leave. Many different things would be improper under this order once that declaration is given. Not just the filing of a lawsuit, not just the eviction writ at the end of a lawsuit. Make sure you remember this is under oath. This is under penalty of perjury, basically. It's as if you were in court swearing under oath to a judge. You say, I declare under penalty of perjury, and that is punishable by fines, potentially imprisonment. It's certainly not something you want to toy with. Make sure that you can complete the declaration truthfully and you're comfortable with what it says and understand it. Remember that all adults should provide a declaration if they want protection. It's not going to be just the single party that leases, but if there's another party there with you and they're legally there under the lease, make sure that both parties provide the declaration, or however many adults you have in the unit. And get legal help if you need it. At Legal Services of Eastern Missouri, we're happy to have your spend time with you. If we're available, you can call in and find someone here or one of our volunteer lawyers that work with us. We have pro bono attorneys that graciously volunteer time that we may be able to link you with. And there are many other places throughout the metro area and beyond that could provide you with legal assistance or advice about the declaration. The good news is it wouldn't take a particularly long amount of time to work through the declaration with someone, and it's relatively a simple document as long as you've already thought a little bit about these categories. So it would not be difficult, generally speaking, to do this rather quickly. And I say that because even if it's a private attorney that you are worried, oh, I might get charged if I ask them, you never know what someone might provide for a low charge or no charge in this type of situation. And of course, if we can take you as a client, our assistance is pretty much always free of charge to the client. I have 2 pages of resources here at the end. I won't read these web links, of course, but these are all clickable links that if you go to our website and pull this document, you'll be able to click any of these links that you would want. If you open this document on our website, I think these will all be clickable on the page. So I just want to lay out kind of what I've given you again. There's our housing section of our COVID help page that has quite a few of these materials on it. And the most important is our CDC Declaration form that is that fillable PDF I mentioned, where you could download it, type on it, or fill in the blanks on it and then return it. There are also the online interview locations provided here that I mentioned earlier, and additional services such as the homelessness prevention form. There's a resource flyer that we have available on our website that shows all kinds of public assistance and nonprofit partners that we have that might provide things like utility assistance, rental assistance, helping you link up with other housing locations, etc. And then there was the United Way that I mentioned as well, and they're linking. So we have this link for you also. That's all the resources that we've got covered in the end of the presentation. Thank you for spending time with us today. If you go to our COVID-19 resources at this website, again, you should be able to receive not only a copy of this slide deck, but also all the other materials that I just mentioned to you. Thank you for spending time, and I hope this has been helpful.